All right. Well, why don't we get started? I don't want to delay us too much longer. Thank you all for joining today. Once again, it's a blessing to be able to at least join with you guys digitally, even though we're socially distancing ourselves from one another. So thank you again. Today we're going to be talking about the saint who is always honored on the fourth Sunday of Lent, which is Saint John of the Ladder, and his book that he wrote, which is called the Ladder of Divine Ascent, which is where Saint John gets his the moniker, of the ladder, because the book that he wrote is called the Ladder of Divine Ascent. So we're gonna get into it, why it's important, what is it, and then I'm gonna read actually some passages from it, and we'll talk about maybe how to interpret them for our own lives in the modern day. I see also too that we have Father Ted is with us today. So Father, if you ever want to unmute yourself and jump in, feel free. You obviously have you can feel free to jump in whenever you feel you want to add something. So thank you, Father, for being with us too. Okay, so when it comes to the Ladder of Divine Ascent, it's important for us to understand kind of what this is, what this text is, and why it's important even to study it, why it's important to look at it, why the church honors it. I mean, it's something that's, if you think about it, there's 5 Sundays in Lent. So the church had to pick 5 things to highlight. And this was one of the things that they picked. So it tells us that it's important, that what is in this text is really important for us on our journey to the kingdom. So what is the Ladder of Divine Ascent? So basically, the Ladder of St. John is an outline for the spiritual life. And it's a book written by a monk named John, who is a saint of our church, who is the abbot of the monastery in Raipho, Egypt. This is not St. John the Baptist. This is not St. John the theologian. This is a different John. He was a monk living in the Egyptian desert. And he wrote this text for his monks. And we'll get into that a little bit more in just a minute. So St. John in this book, he uses the imagery and the framework of a ladder with 30 rungs, the little bars that you climb up, by which we go from earth to heaven. So he uses this imagery of the ladder as kind of painting a picture for what the spiritual life is. Going from earth to heaven, going up step by step up this ladder. And this imagery is not something that he made up. It's actually found in the Bible, in the Old Testament book of Genesis. I told you guys I was going to talk about the Old Testament. So in the book of Genesis, chapter 28, the patriarch Jacob, who is one of the foundational characters in the history of Israel. You have Abraham. Abraham's son is Isaac. Isaac's son is Jacob. So this is Abraham, who is the man of the promise, of the covenant. This is his grandson. And Jacob will be the father of Joseph, of the 12 tribes, basically. So Jacob's hugely important. So Jacob now is traveling through the land, and he stops for the night, and he goes to sleep, and in his sleep he sees a dream. And I want to read really quickly this passage from Genesis. This is Genesis 28, chapter 28, verses 10 to 15. So it starts, Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. Those places, to be honest, are not, to me, they're not that important, but they're descriptions that are in the Bible. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth, with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. So this is an important moment in the scriptures. So in this dream, basically, Jacob sees angels going from heaven to earth and back. They're going up and down, using this ladder that has been put up between earth and heaven. And God is there at the top of the ladder, and he reaffirms his promise to Israel, which is the promise that he will give them, like he says, like we just read, this land that Jacob is now walking through and dwelling in. And he promises that he will watch over them and care for them, and he will not leave them until this promise is fulfilled. So this is really important, and I want to share with you really quickly an icon of this, because it'll show us. We'll see how it compares to the Ladder of Divine Ascent. So you'll see here, Jacob, the patriarch Jacob, is sleeping on the bottom of the icon, and then you have this ladder going up to heaven. And in our Orthodox tradition, we actually have Panagia in Christ at the top, and you have the angels going up and down. So this is the icon of the patriarch Jacob and his vision of the ladder going from earth to heaven. Now, let me pull up my notes again. So, in the Ladder of Divine Ascent, we have very similar imagery. And now I'll show you that so we can kind of get an idea of what we're talking about here. You can see that the imagery is very similar. You have at the center is this ladder going from earth up to heaven. At the top of the ladder, we still see Christ. And at the bottom of the ladder, although it's kind of cut off, is usually an icon of Saint John of the ladder, and he's pointing. He's like directing people to go up. Now, we also see in the top left corner of this icon, we see angels, just like in the first icon. But what's different in this icon is that there's two differences. First of all, there are people going up the ladder, people going up and down. And then we also have these little black figures, which are representative of the angels of darkness, otherwise the demons, who try to pull us off the ladder and try to get us to fall and to stumble. So we have a very similar imagery here between Jacob's ladder and the ladder of St. John. And the idea really is the same, is that heaven and earth, there's a path now between heaven and earth. In the first icon, the path was only for the angels. But in this icon, the path has been opened to us to also journey to heaven. And we're able to do this because of Christ, because of what Christ did through his death and resurrection. He opened, and ascension and Pentecost, he opens to us the path into the kingdom. So that's an important distinction as well. The promised land from Jacob's ladder is now, we understand it no longer to be a geographical land that we're going to inherit one day as Christians, but now the promised land for us is the very kingdom of God itself. So it makes a lot of sense, at least in my mind, that St. John uses this imagery, and really the church puts this imagery in front of us again and again during Lent every year, because it takes this kind of monumental process of saving our souls, having our souls be saved, which is like, where do we even begin? It's hard to even really understand where to start. And it puts it into a form that's organized and systematic. Now, we can't, even though that makes it easier for our brains and our hearts to process, we can't think of it in a legalistic way, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But I think if we think of it in that way, where it's this kind of like systematic process of salvation, it makes sense why the church highlights this again and again. And actually, Metropolitan Callistus Ware, who's an Orthodox theologian in England in the modern day, still alive, he says that with the exception of the Bible and the service books, there's no work in Eastern Christianity, meaning Orthodoxy, that has been studied, copied, and translated more than the Ladder of Divine Ascent. So that shows us that this is a really important text. Now, before we start diving in and reading a little bit, I think it's important to make the point and make the note that this book was written by a monk for monks, for monks that he was caring for. But that doesn't mean that just because it's a monastic work that we can just ignore it, or that it doesn't apply to us and to our lives who live in society, who live in the world. Yes, monastics express and live out their Christian calling in a very different way than we do, but the calling is one and the same. The calling is to climb the ladder. Just the monks are not the only ones that should be striving for holiness. That's something that we should be also working for too. So for example, St. John has a chapter dedicated to the renunciation of the world, which sounds very oblique and ominous, but we're actually going to read from that chapter in a little bit, which is step 1. For monks, this means literally leaving the world to go and live in a monastery and dedicate their lives to prayer. But we also are called to renounce the world in our own way. We can think of it like we live in the world, in society, in other words, but we renounce the passions that characterize the world. Things like greed, things like lust, things like gluttony, anger, gossip, slandering, etc., etc., etc. All these things that we would call earthly or worldly passions, we renounce them, even though we live in the world. In other words, the fact that we live in society doesn't excuse us from becoming Christ-like, because that's what this book is about. It's a guide, basically. It's St. John's guide for how to become Christ-like. So this book, even though, again, it's written for monks, it's written by a monk, it can be a support for us on that journey, on that quest. Though the application to our own lives is going to look a little bit different for us, obviously, than it would for a monk. So my first kind of pro tip, so to speak, would be that if you're going to read this book or read excerpts of it, to do so under the guidance of a spiritual father, through confession or through meeting with your spiritual father, that can kind of help you to apply the teachings of the book in a way that makes sense for you. Not to burn you out, not to overburden you, but also not to take things into your own hands and make them too easy. Because a lot of times if we try to make spiritual decisions for ourselves, sometimes we make things too easy on us ourselves too. So a spiritual father is going to really help a lot with that. There's also a couple of good commentaries on this book that are written for lay people. They're kind of written for that very purpose, to kind of take the very sometimes can be difficult things that St. John writes, or difficult for us to kind of comprehend or see their application. These authors commentate on them and kind of put them down on the level of a layperson. One is called Ascending the Heights, and one is called 30, I think it's called 30 Steps to Heaven. So there are other books that kind of take this big text by St. John and make it a little more, it kind of like translates it for the layperson, so to speak. So if you feel like you want to look into one of those books as well, it may help you, along with your spiritual father, to kind of give you the guidance to apply these teachings into our daily lives. So getting into kind of the content of the ladder can be broken down into 3 main sections. And I didn't make this up. This is taken from that book, Ascending the Heights, that I had pointed out just a second ago. So the first section is really it's about breaking with the world, which is the renunciation, which we had just talked about and we'll talk more about, and detachment and exile. So basically the first portion of our spiritual journey, in other words, is kind of separating ourselves from the characteristics of the world that pull us away from God. I think that's a good way to think of it. Again, for us, we're not monks. We're not physically leaving the world. We're not leaving our families. No one's saying that. But the break that has to happen with us, is with the things of the world that pull us away from God. So that's a really important first step. The second portion, which makes kind of a large part of this book, is practice of the virtues. So once we've kind of renounced these evil practices of the world and we've decided to make a break with them, St. John will guide us on how to practice the virtues. And the virtues are kind of the opposite of those those evil practices that pull us away from God. The virtues are holy practices that bring us closer to God. So there's a few different kinds of those virtues. You have, for example, kind of these like base fundamental virtues that underlie everything else. Things like obedience, repentance, remembrance of death, which I know sounds very morbid, but for in our Orthodox understanding, it's really critical. And then we have the struggle against the passions. So there's different kinds of passions. There's kind of like the basic non-physical passions, meaning things like anger, malice, slander, falsehood, lying, deception, things like that. There's the kind of the higher level non-physical passions: insensitivity, fear, pride, vainglory. And then there's physical passions, which are gluttony, lust, and avarice. So as we go through some of the text today, we'll get into one of these chapters. So the first part, again, is kind of the breaking with the world. And we have fundamental virtues, and then some of these struggles against the passions. And then the last section is about union with God. And the chapters in that section have to do with stillness, prayer, dispassion, and love. So we have kind of this progression: breaking with the world, practicing the virtues, and then being united to God, which is our final destination. And I think it's important to note that and keep that kind of in the front of our mind, that the ladder is not an end in itself. The purpose is not simply to climb the ladder forever and ever. It's not just to struggle and suffer and endure, going up all these different steps. The ladder is a means to an end. The ladder is a process by which we are united to God. So it's important for us to remember that we're not, in Orthodoxy, when we talk about struggling and when we talk about fighting against ourselves and self-denial, it's not for that sake. It's not for that. It's to prepare us for union with God. We do all these other things. We persevere through spiritual feats or through spiritual struggles because we have an understanding that this life will pass away, that this world will pass away, as the scriptures say, but that God promises eternal joy for those who struggle and endure. So all of these things that we do and all these things that St. John talks about in this book are really to lead us to this reality of a union with God, eternal life, eternal joy. So even when you're reading it, and sometimes when you read St. John, it can be very, certain parts of it can be very negative. It can be very disheartening if we don't have that joy in front of us. It can cause, we have to be careful about how we read it. But to always remember that at the end is the joy and love and union with God. And that's what all this is for. So I guess before we jump into some of the excerpts, I'll unmute you all in case anybody has any questions. I can answer them at this time. Just jump on in if anyone has a question. Otherwise, we'll start reading. Going once, going twice. Okay, I'm gonna mute y'all again. Very good. Okay. By the way, I purchased the Ladder of Divine Ascent today on Kindle for $3. So that's if you have a Kindle and you want to read a little bit. But again, if you're going to read, I would talk with your spiritual father while you're going through it too. So we're going to read. I picked one chapter from each section. Remember we had talked about the 3 sections about the breaking with the world, practice of the virtues, and then union with God. I picked one chapter from each section, and I'm going to read just excerpts from them. So you're not going to get like the full disclosure. You're not going to get the full packet, so to speak, but you're just going to get the syllabus, just to kind of give us a taste of what St. John, what the book is like, and what's in there for us and how it can benefit us and kind of lead us on our spiritual life as well. So the first chapter I'm going to read from is step 1, which is called On Renunciation. So this is the very beginning, the first few lines. When writing to the servants of God, it is best to begin with God himself. And I think that's kind of points to what we had just talked about how it's really about God. It's not about suffering and struggling. It's about going through this process to be united with God. Our God and King is indeed good, supremely good, and all good. Of the intelligent creatures made by him and glorified with the honor of free will, some are friends of him, while others are truly his servants. Still others are worthless servants, and others are completely separated from God. Still others, although they are mere creatures, are counted as his opponents. When we say friends of God, we mean people who surround God as intellectual and incorporeal beings. So God's friends are those who draw near to him. And that's kind of, again, uses this imagery of the ladder moving towards God. As for the worthless servant, we speak of those who after receiving baptism have not kept the oaths they made before God. By those who are separated from God, we imply the heretics and unbelievers. Lastly, by adversaries of God, we mean those who have rejected and fled from the commandments of the Lord and who wage a terrible war on those who wish to fulfill it. So at the very beginning, he kind of breaks down these different kinds of people and their relationship with God. And I think it's kind of to awaken our souls, awaken our senses a bit, to think about what am I? Where do I stand? Where am I standing with God? And what do I need to do in order to become his friend, to become a beloved child of God? Let's see here. So the next, I'm going to skip a little bit ahead. So he writes here that the impious one is a mortal creature with an intelligent nature, who of his own free will puts his life behind him and thinks of his maker, the always existing, as not existing. So in other words, someone who's impious, meaning not reverent to God, treats God like he doesn't exist. The iniquitous man is one who makes God's laws according to his own fashion and tries to mix faith in God with heresies that work in opposition to him. So someone who works iniquity is someone who takes God's laws and basically makes them whatever he wants. So they live kind of by their own rules. The Christian, however, is the one who seeks to imitate Christ in thought, word, and works, as far as he is able as a human being, believing correctly and simply in the Holy Trinity. He is a lover of God who is communion with all that is sinless and natural, and as far as he is capable, leaves aside nothing good. So this kind of gives us the definition of what St. John calls a Christian, someone who seeks to imitate Christ in every possible way, to be pure and to be sinless in every way as much as we're able. So I think that's another nice little page, a nice little reading there too, to kind of give us a sense of what St. John is leading us to as an introduction. I'll continue. Everyone who willingly left behind all the things of this world has done so either for the reward of the future kingdom, or on account of the magnitude of their sins, or because of their love for God. If they did not leave the world for any of these reasons, their withdrawal was irrational. So he kind of gives some of the reasons why we would even go up the ladder. Basically he's saying if we don't have one of these reasons behind us, then it doesn't make sense why you would kill yourself to try to climb this ladder in the beginning. Now here he talks also about how the path of the ladder and the life of the ladder is one that's difficult. It's not something that, basically that the Christian life is not something that's just going to be, easy. And he says, everyone who goes into the worthy fight, which is both narrow and difficult, but also light, should understand that they must jump into the fire if they truly expect the reward of the heavenly fire to be within them. To those who embark on this struggle, they must give up everything, despise everything, scorn everything, and remove everything, so that they will be able to put down a strong foundation. A firm foundation consists of 3 levels, 3 columns. These are innocence, fasting, and self-control. And I think this is a good place to point out again that application for a monk versus a person in the world is going to be very different. So when he says that in order to kind of start this journey, you have to leave everything behind. For the monk, that's literally they leave everything behind. They sell everything they have. They give the proceeds to the poor. They leave their families and they go and they live in a monastery where they have nothing. And everything they do is for their brother monks, not for themselves. For us, what we're leaving behind is everything that gets between us and God. That's the calling here. The calling is that there should be nothing for any reason that separates us from God. And I think a lot of times we have to think deeply too about even things that are part of our daily lives and daily struggles that we may not think about, that maybe are getting in the way of God, or maybe we're misusing them and they become something that becomes an impediment. And I'll give you an example from my own life. I grew up a big sports fan, and to me, there's nothing, again, there's nothing naturally impure or immoral about watching sports. But if I watch sports to the point where I'm not praying, or if I'm neglecting my spiritual duties to watch the Cubs game or something like that, then my sports fandom has become an idol, and it has taken God's place. It has come between me and God. And what he's saying is those kinds of things have to be left behind. So it's a good reminder and a good place to kind of start reflecting on our own lives to say, what am I doing in my own life? Are there things that keep me from coming to God, growing closer to God? And if there are, how do we get past that? How do we reframe what we have in our life so that God is at the center and nothing is stopping us from reaching him? Let's see here. Then he gives some words of encouragement. He says, "So let us run our race with zeal, as those who are summoned by our God and our King, since the time we have is brief, and lest we should be found on the day of our death with no fruit and die of hunger. Let us be pleasing to the Lord, as troops please their general, since we must provide a full account of our ministry at the end of the campaign. Let us be afraid of the Lord no less than brute beasts. Because I have observed men who were about to steal, not fearing God, but upon hearing the bark of dogs, immediately turned back." So in other words, he said, I've seen thieves who are more afraid of dogs than they are of God. What the fear of God did not bring about, the fear of animals accomplished. Let us have a love for God that is at least on par with our respect for our friends. So in other words, if we respect our friends, let's also respect God. I have many times seen people who scandalized God and have not been affected at all. But those same people I have seen afterward irritating their friends over some small thing, then use every possible device, offering an apology, both by themselves and with the aid of friends and family, not leaving aside gifts, so that they might regain their former friendship. So the point he's making is, we all have sins against God, but many times we either make excuses or we justify them, or we don't think about them. But when we offend one of our friends, it's like we can't stop thinking about it, and we do everything that we can to repair the relationship, which we should, especially seeking forgiveness. He's like, we should also do that with God too. So a lot of what he writes in this book is about kind of undoing some of those negative practices that we have towards our Lord. Now, this is an interesting section. This is actually addressed now to people that live in the world. He says, some people in the world living carelessly have asked me, sorry, I have someone waiting to get into the meeting room here. Some people in the world living carelessly have asked me, we have wives and many social concerns. How could we possibly lead a life of solitude? And I think this is a valid question for us, right? Like, we all have family. Many of us have families. Many of us have work obligations. We have, whatever it may be. We're very busy. As Americans, we're typically very busy. So how can we live a truly spiritual life? I answered them, do as much good as you can. Do not speak ill of anyone. Do not steal. Do not lie. Do not be boastful. Do not hate. Go to church. Have mercy on the poor. Do not be a stumbling block to anyone. Do not draw near the bed of another. And be satisfied with what you receive from your wives. If you do these things, you will be close to the kingdom of heaven. So he gives kind of some very practical points. So like, if you're living in the world, these are things that you can focus on in order to kind of draw yourself closer to God as well. One more here from this first section about renunciation. Those who are set on ministering to Christ with the aid of spiritual fathers and their own knowledge will strive to find a place and mode of life and a dwelling place and suitable practices. The community life is not for everyone because of greed. The solitary places are not for everyone because of anger. Each person must ponder what is best for his needs. So here he's referring to monks. Some monks live in communities of monks. Some monks live by themselves. He says, even for monks, everybody's needs are different, and you have to kind of find what works best for you. And I think that's very important for us in our own spiritual lives too. We have to find practices and places and times that work for us in order to work on our spiritual lives. And in case you weren't able to join us last night for our family night talk on the little church in the home, the recording is on there. We touched on that last night too. So if you want, you can go onto the recording. The link is on Facebook, and you can watch last night's session too. And we talked more about that. So it's important, again, to realize that every person is different. Everyone's needs are going to be different. And we each have to really work at and ponder and think about what's going to be best for us on our journey to the kingdom. All right, so that's the first chapter I wanted to highlight. It comes from that first section again, a break with the world, breaking with the worldly, if we think about it that way, and kind of leaving the worldly behind so that we can strive for God. The next chapter I'm going to focus on is from the second section, which is about the practicing of the virtues. And this chapter is called On the Remembrance of Injuries. And what he's talking about here is like holding grudges, seeking revenge, when you're constantly remember whenever someone does something against you and you hold on to it in your heart. So again, this is one of those non-physical passions that we talked about that pull us away from God. So there's a couple of really interesting passages here that I wanted to read. And this kind of gives you an idea of the spiritual guidance that he gives that I think is very applicable to our own lives. The blessed virtues are like Jacob's ladder, which we talked about. And the profane vices are like the manacles that fell off the chief of the apostles, Peter. He's talking about like chains. In the New Testament, Peter, after Christ ascends, is imprisoned and he's chained. And at some point, an angel comes and releases the chains. So the vices are like chains. The virtues lead from one to the next and carry up the one who chooses them to heaven. The vices, by contrast, by their very character, bring forth and choke each other. Since we have just spoken about how absurd anger names remembrances of injuries its child, it is fitting that we should speak about this topic here. So the previous chapter is about anger. So he says anger leads to this remembrance of wrongs, of this holding grudges and things like that. So he's like, so now I'll talk about that now. The remembrance of injuries is the completion of anger, the custodian of sins, enmity of uprightness, destruction of virtues, venom for the soul, a worm in the mind, disgrace of prayer, ceasing of entreaty, lack of love, a pin fastened in the soul, a joyless feeling beloved in the tenderness of bitterness, unceasing sin, vigilant iniquity, constant ill will. This gloomy and malevolent passion, remembrance of injuries, is one of those that is begotten but has no children. For this reason, we do not have much to say about it, although he does write a couple pages. So he makes it very clear that something like holding grudges or seeking revenge on people is a very serious sin. And whenever he speaks about the passions, he kind of writes in that way. He's like, oh, this sin is this and this and this and this and this. I think I think that kind of sticks out for me is venom for the soul. In other words, if you're holding grudges in your heart, it's like poison. It's like poison for your soul. I'll keep going here. The one who has ceased from anger has killed the remembrance of injuries, because childbearing only occurs while the father lives. In other words, if you don't have anger in your heart, you won't keep grudges because you need one to have the other. The one who has achieved love has cast out revenge, but the one who nourishes a feeling of ill will amasses never-ending misery for himself. So again, he speaks very strongly about why it's important not to hold on to things. Remembrance of injuries is an excellent interpreter of Scripture, the sort that adapts the words of the Spirit to its own interpretation. So in other words, he's saying if you have this passion, if you struggle with this passion, it leads you to taking what's in the scriptures and making them whatever you feel like, adapting them to your own devices. Let it be disgraced by the Jesus prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner, which cannot be recited with it. So in other words, if we have malice in our hearts or seeking revenge, it blocks us from saying the Jesus prayer. We can't say it effectively if we have that in our hearts. After much toiling, when you still cannot take out this thorn, you should make amends with your enemy, even if it is only by word. Then it may be that you will be embarrassed by your persistent hypocrisy toward him, and with your conscience biting at you like a fire, you will perhaps feel a genuine love for him. So this is very practical advice now. He says, even if it's just for a show, make amends with your enemy, and then your conscience will keep biting at you, and eventually you're going to let it go because you're going to feel like a hypocrite. So he's saying it's better to do it that way than to just hold on to things forever. You will recognize you have destroyed this vice, not only when you pray on behalf of your enemy, nor when you exchange presents with him, nor when you summon him to dine with you, but only at the point when you learn that he has suffered a spiritual or bodily mishap, and you grieve and shed tears for him as if for yourself. A spiteful hermit is a serpent hidden in a burrow, which contains deadly venom. So he says, you'll know when you've overcome this, when your enemy is suffering and you suffer like it was your own suffering. So in his vision of this passion, to overcome it is to feel complete empathy for your enemy, and feel their suffering as your own suffering. He adds here, the remembrance of Jesus's afflictions will cure the remembrance of injuries, which is embarrassed by his long suffering. So in other words, if we think about Christ, and in just a few weeks, we're going to have this right in front of us. If we remember Christ on the cross, all the suffering that he endured, and his patience and his mercy and his forgiving of his own executors, it'll be hard for us to kind of maintain our stubbornness and holding on to these wrongs that have been done against us. So that's kind of a little sample from this second section, and there's many chapters in this second section which focus on the virtues and the passions that talk about different things. There's one, for example, on gluttony. There's one on things like talking too much, which it seems like to us it seems innocuous, but I think he makes good points that we have to think about. He has ones on anger. He has things on pride. Pride is a big one too. Really quick before I go into the last section and kind of some readings from that, I'm going to mute on everyone again. Are there any questions or thoughts that anyone wanted to kind of add to the discussion right now? No? Okay. We'll read just from the last section now. We'll read a little bit. So now again, we move from the renunciation of the world and of sinfulness. We've gotten a little taste and the sample of what his writings are on the passions and the virtues. And now we'll get a little taste of that section on union with God, experiencing joy and what that looks like and what is required for it. And that's the top of the ladder. If we think about it, really, that's like the top of the ladder. So this is chapter 27. In the ladder, there's 30 chapters, 30 steps. So this is chapter 27. So it's one of the last chapters. And it's on blessed stillness of body and soul. And he writes a lot. When he writes about living in solitude, he's writing about monks. He's directing monks that are going to be living by themselves in the wilderness. But I think for us, whenever we hear living in solitude or a solitary monk, we can think about our own selves and our own spiritual lives, finding time for silence and stillness in our prayer. So when I'm reading these passages, maybe keep that in mind. Not that I'm telling anyone to go and leave their families and go live in the desert, but that we all have to kind of find our own desert even within our day-to-day. So I'll read a few little passages here from this section. It's chapter 27. Stillness of the body is the understanding and lessening of practices and feelings. Stillness of the soul is understanding one's thoughts and inviolate mind. A companion of stillness is brave and unceasing strength of thought, which keeps a regular watch at the gateway of the heart and kills or wards off thoughts that come to it. So in other words, he's saying when we pray, if we have a mind that is still, if we're in a state of stillness, then our heart and our minds are strong and vigilant and ward off thoughts that try to distract us or take the stillness away from us. He who is quiet in the deep of his heart will perceive the truth of this last statement. However, one who is still a youth is oblivious and ignorant to it. A discriminating solitary does not need words, since he shows his words by his deeds. The start of stillness is to cast off all noise as troubling for the deep recesses of the soul, and the conclusion of it is not to be afraid of disturbances and to stay immune to them. However, when he goes out, still without a word, he is caring and completely a household of love. He is not readily moved to talk, nor is he given to anger. The converse is clear as well. So what he's saying there, I thought that last section especially was powerful to me, at least, is the start of stillness is to cast off all noise as troubling, and for the deep recesses of the soul. And I think a lot of times, again, for me, I know I struggle with that a lot, where it's like there may be an opportunity to go and pray and quiet, to have peace and quiet and to pray and to find some stillness, which I think we lack and we crave. I know as a parent of a young child, it's like by the time they go to sleep, it's like the one thing you want more than anything else is some peace and quiet. But a lot of times, even when that moment comes and Panayoti's finally sleeping, it's like the first thing we do is turn on the TV, and then we have noise again. So he's saying the beginning of stillness is valuing that quiet and that stillness over everything, over every noise. Sometimes things are unavoidable, especially us living in society, but there are also times, I think, when we choose to have noise instead of stillness. And he's saying you can't begin a life of stillness if you're going to prefer noise over that stillness. So I think that's important there. The heavenly powers gather together in worship with the one whose soul is at peace, and they stay lovingly with him. The converse of this is clear. So that's powerful. That's a powerful imagery, right? Like if someone has a peaceful soul, a soul that's at peace, the whole heavenly powers come to worship with that soul. And there's a Russian saint who lived on Mount Athos who was very famous for saying, acquire the spirit of peace and thousands around you will be saved. So on the one hand, our peace, our spiritual peace attracts the angels of heaven. And what Saint Seraphim is saying is that our spiritual peace attracts people to the spiritual life and to salvation as well. So finding that stillness is really important. He continues here, I have observed those living alone who stoke the flame of their longing for God, kindling fire with fire, love with love, longing for longing. The one who lives alone is an earthly image of a heavenly angel who with the paper of love and with the letters of zeal has set free his prayer from laziness and neglect. The solitary is the one who publicly announces, O God, my heart is prepared. The solitary is the one who states, I sleep, but my heart is alert. I find that very beautiful. That basically the one who seeks this stillness and this that stillness is our fire. It's our fire for God. It's our longing for God, and we're able to kind of stoke this and kindle this with our love for God and with our stillness. And this fire is able to grow and build within us. Fire, he says, fire with fire. And if we live that life, we become, he says, like an angel who basically our prayer becomes like love letters to God. And we tell God that our heart is ready to meet him, which I think, again, is very beautiful. So we see kind of how the style kind of is evolving now that he's getting to the end of his counsels. It's not so much that like speaking negatively about the passions. Now he's speaking very positively about that union with God. And it reminds us that that's really what the goal is. It's not about the suffering and overcoming these passions in themselves, but the struggling and the suffering is for this purpose, so that our fire can be kindled and so that we can make our hearts ready to be united with God. Those whose mind has found sincere prayer speak with the Lord face to face, as if talking into the ear of the king. Those who use vocal prayers prostrate before him, as if in the presence of the whole court. But those who dwell in the world entreat the king in the middle of the din of the multitudes. If you have discovered the practice of prayer accurately, you will understand what I have described. So basically he says if we're not finding stillness, it's like we're trying to talk to God with all this noise going around us, it's like the whole noise of the whole city being around us. But if we speak to God with a still heart, it's like we talk to God face to face, like we're talking into his ear, which again is very beautiful imagery. It reminds me of Saint Porphyrios. Saint Porphyrios was a saint in Greece. He just died in the 90s. And he was a priest in Athens in Omonia Square. And he struggled for a time with the noise of the city being always outside his church. But a monk, he received wisdom once from someone who told him that if you throw a rock in water, it makes ripples. But if you throw a bigger rock somewhere else, the first ripples are overcome and only the big ripples remain. So if the first stone is the noise around us, our prayer can be the second stone, the bigger one that overcomes. Our stillness, in other words, can be the second stone that overcomes even the noise around us. So even for us living in the world, again, this is that application, right? For us living in the world, if we can build up that life of stillness, it can overcome even the noise that we find ourselves in constantly. But we have to seek it and work on it and build it too. The one who has achieved stillness has entered into the depths of the mysteries. The solitary is the one who flees from all human company, but without enmity, in the same way that others rush to it eagerly. He desires to continue receiving the holy sweetness. I think, again, the application of that is that we have to seek God just as much as we seek company with our friends and our family, to understanding that God is our family, that He is our Father in heaven. Here are the marks, routes, and evidence of those who are correctly living in solitude: an untroubled mind, pure and holy thoughts, rapture to the Lord, remembrance of eternal punishments, the quickness of death, ceaseless desire for prayer, unsleeping watchfulness, a loss of lust, ignorance of attachment, a departure from the world, the passing of gluttony, a certain knowledge of the divine, a spring of discernment, peace with tears, the passing of chattiness, and many other similar things which normal people are likely to think strange. So he's saying if we truly live a life of stillness, these are the characteristics that we overcome X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D. And then the last one I'll share is that he writes here, solitude is unending worship and waiting for God. Let the memory of Jesus be present with each breath, and then you will realize the benefit of stillness. So again, some beautiful words and words of encouragement for us in our own lives, that that also is our calling, is to constantly remember Christ and to be waiting for Him, to be longing for Him, to increase our desire for Him. And I've heard many priests now speak about this time that we're going through, where many of us are not able to, almost all of us are not able to go to church, to allow that to kind of create a hunger for God, seeking for Him in new ways, not just by attending church, but to seek Him out in new ways, so that we can increase our longing for Him and our anticipation for being united with Him, not only again when we come to church, but eternally in the kingdom of heaven. So I just wanted today to give that little kind of brief sampler platter, if you want to call it that, on St. John of the Ladder. Again, we honor him every fourth Sunday of Lent, which is this coming Sunday, and give a little taste of what the Ladder is like. I personally haven't read through the whole thing. I've read certain chapters, but it's on my list for sure. Especially now during the Lenten season, it's a very nice guide for us in our spiritual lives as well. So I'll unmute you all. We just have a couple more minutes here before I need to get going. But if anyone has any questions or comments or anything like that, I'd be happy to answer them at this time to the best of my ability.
Father, I have a question for you.
Yes.
Do you have you ever, like with meditation prior to prayer, are you considering meditation the same thing as prayer when you're doing reading in reading of these books? Or are you considering meditation and prayer the same or different?
So I think the word meditation, I think we have to be careful what we're talking about, because there's also like New Age meditation, and there's like meditation is kind of like secular meditation, and then there's also like the Christian Orthodox practice of stillness. I think for us, beginning prayer or beginning study or a spiritual study or any spiritual work, I think what I prefer to the term meditation maybe is just taking a moment to kind of calm the heart and calm my mind using the Jesus prayer. So I'll, if I have my Kombuskini, you don't need a Kombuskini to pray the Jesus prayer, but allowing that to kind of calm you down, finding that kind of little bit of peace that you can have, and then warming up your heart to open it up to that prayer. I've also heard that some people will just, before they pray, will just go in their rooms and just sit in silence for 10 minutes, and try not to allow thoughts to enter into their hearts, but just kind of pray internally the Jesus prayer to kind of, again, calm them down, and then warm up the heart for that prayer or reading the scriptures or whatever spiritual work you're going to be doing. To be honest, I don't know much about secular meditation. I know it's kind of a big thing right now. I personally haven't done much of it. I haven't done any of it. I haven't looked into it much, but that's kind of when we're talking about prayer or spiritual study or anything like that, that's kind of what I do, or not what I do, whatever, not to speak of myself, but that's kind of what I would recommend.
Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to thank you for bringing all of this to my attention, because I mean, I think that we all think that we're doing a good job as being good Christians. And then when you actually look into like all of these steps in the ladder, and it was eye-opening to me to think that, oh, I'm doing a good job, but really I'm not. There are areas that I need to address in my life as well. Number one being trying to shut out all that noise.
Mm-hmm.
And it really hit home to me when you said how we seek to fix relationships with friends, the minute something goes wrong, but do
Right.
we do the same with Christ and with
Yeah.
God? And
Mm-hmm.
so this was very eye-opening. So I appreciate this. Thank you.
Glory be
Thank
to
you.
God. I think to your point, I think there can be kind of a tension or a balance there, right? That we realize our shortcomings, that we realize our brokenness, but that we also struggle to overcome them, and we do that through Christ. So like, I think we can be trying really hard and doing our best as Christians and still be broken. You know what I mean? Like those things can both be true at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive. So just because you see brokenness in yourself shouldn't lead you to despair, first of all, but again, to inspire us to work harder or just do our best to find Christ and seek him out, because he's the one that can fix the brokenness. We have to realize that we can't fix our brokenness on our own strength. We can work and do our best, but really the healing comes from the doctor, who is Christ. So, I don't want you to think like when you read St. John the Letter, just to think like, oh, I'm going to hell. You know what I mean? That's a lot because you can go down that path too, but that's not the point. The point is to realize where we are, that we are broken, and to inspire us and open our hearts to seek out Christ even more fervently in our life. So
Sure. Okay.
If anyone, I can take one more question if anyone has time. Sorry for Panayotis crying in the background there. Any more questions? Okay. If not, that's great. Thank you all for your attentiveness. I'm going to continue this next week for sure. The flyer I'm working really hard to get better at posting things early instead of last minute. So it should be ready. The flyer should be ready by tomorrow or Saturday too. So you'll have the times. You'll have all the times and the themes for next week's sessions as well. So thank you again. I'll post the recording again. If you know people that wanted to listen, couldn't, they can always listen to the recording after. Thank you.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you, Father.
And God willing, you all will be able to follow our services Friday night and Sunday morning as well.
Yep.
All right. Thank you, guys. God bless.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you.